Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Lake Huron Regional Chief for the Anishinabek Nation, Scott McLeod. McLeod was first elected to Nipissing First Nation Council in 2003 and first elected chief in 2015, a role he maintained for 3 consecutive terms. Recently, McLeod has taken a lead role with the Chiefs of Ontario and the Assembly of First Nations in advocating against Bill C-53 and protecting First Nations rights against false claims and assertions of Indigenous identity. Chief McLeod, thanks so much for being with us here on the show this week.
Thank you for having me.
As mentioned off the top, almost or more than 20 years now in politics. So what led you down the path to pursuing leadership roles?
Well, I guess it's looking back, it's not something that I, as a young person said, I want to be chief when I grow up or anything like that. I think it was just my place within the community and, more or less the community choosing me to be that role rather than myself making a conscious decision to be in that position. Spent most of my entirety of my life in my community, very passionate about my community. And I think, that reflected on the choices made by our community for me to represent them, and I'll always be honored for that, and I continue to do so in other capacities.
Were there some big issues for Lake Nipissing First Nation at the time that really got you involved?
Yeah, actually, I think the catalyst that led me into this position. Firstly, my background in education was in fisheries and wildlife management, and around the time when I ran for chief, there was a lot of issues surrounding the fishery stocks within Lake Nipissing, and that was basically on the heels of a court decision which we had won a decade earlier or so regarding access to commercial fishing, and there was a real need for proper management of the fishery. I ran my campaign at that time on to bring in proper management, and the community felt that that's what was needed at the time, and so that was my first role as chief in the community, was to take that on. And the lake has since been much improved, and we all enjoy a healthy fishery as a result.
Have some of the issues, the challenges, the opportunities in the nation changed during your time in leadership?
Oh yes, for sure. I mean, anybody in this line of work knows that you resolve one issue and there's 10 more behind it. So yeah, the issues, some of them are still there that I made efforts in rectifying, but some of these issues are very deep, concerning issues with substance abuse and child welfare and that kind of thing that is a long healing process, and it's going to take more than one leader and the entire community for that matter to resolve those issues. So it's always changing, that landscape, but a lot of the issues are quite common to other First Nations across Ontario as well as across Canada.
Right. Chief McLeod, as mentioned, you were chief of your nation for 3 consecutive terms. Were there things that you were proud of in particular in your time as chief?
Yeah, for sure. As mentioned, coming in with a major issue of the fisheries and the health of the lake, that's something that I'm proud of, and I think of these things even before I came into the office as how I want to be remembered in decades from now, much as I remember past chiefs such as Chief Shalgijic, who signed the treaty. And I want to be seen as somebody that made positive strides within our community. There's that. There's the annuities settlement, which was a very difficult one. But I look back and, as much as it pretty much ended my term as chief within the community, as it did a lot of good chiefs in the Robinson-Huron Treaty. I look at it as it being a necessary thing that I went through. We needed great leadership at that time, and I felt that it was something that I was put there to do, and I did my very best, and I think a lot of chiefs did. That may not have been reflected in some of the feelings towards the end results, but I think time will look at that positively. I've always said, I would rather be the chief 100 years from now that people remember as doing the right thing at his own demise than just doing what people wanted in that moment just for personal gain. And it was a tough thing, but I think we're all better for it.
I think a lot of outsiders look at that case and maybe not understanding it all as, wow, look at what they did, we need to do that here type of thing. I guess, what was the impact on the leadership there?
Well, it was difficult. I mean, I've always said going into this, when, you have a group of people that have been traumatized for the better part of 2 centuries, neglected, starved, forced into assimilation, forced into residential schools, oppressed from economic opportunities. If you really want to see the trauma that's a cause, then put $10 billion on the table and the trauma will come out. And, it's a good thing. We had to go through it, and we deserved to see those financial rewards, but there was a cost.
Regional Chief, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Scott McLeod, the Regional Chief, Lake Huron Regional Chief for the Anishinabek Nation. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that role, your new role with the Anishinabek Nation.
Yeah, so I guess firstly, it's been evolving those roles on how they're going to serve their First Nations that are affiliated with the Anishinabek Nation. I was originally chosen when I was sitting as community chief to represent the Huron region on top of what I was doing as community chief. And then they changed the structure a little bit, and they had 4 deputy chiefs, and then they went back to 1 single deputy chief and 4 regional chiefs. So when in 2024, after the election and my failed attempt to get back in with my community, I was already appointed as the regional chief of the Huron region, which represents 17 communities in that region. And so the Grand Chief, the newly elected Grand Chief, Linda DeBosge at the time, asked me to stay as a regional chief, even though I was no longer a community chief. And so at the request of the rest of the Huron chiefs at that time, who wanted me to stay as well, I ended up staying and working, continuing to work with the Anishinabek Nation as the regional chief.
One of the things that you've been doing in that role, and previously as well, as you've been outspoken and critical of Ontario's Bill 5 and the federal Bill C5. Bills meant to ignite the economy, get projects, so-called projects in the national interest moving along. What were or are your concerns with these pieces of legislation?
Well, if you really break down, the treaties that were pre-Confederation, if you look at the premise or the basis of the foundation of what those treaties involved, it's really land-based. And what I mean by that is it's protection of our inherent rights as a people that pre-existed Confederation, pre-existed contact. That's why we call them inherent. It wasn't bestowed upon us by a British Crown or a Canadian government. Those rights were intact prior to all of that. And our rights were based from the lands that we lived in. Our laws were based from the lands that we lived in. In other words, we lived under what we refer to as natural law. And natural law is the land governs us. And so in European models, the government basically governs the land, which is quite the opposite of what we do. Because we knew that you can make all the laws you want based on, exploiting land or cutting trees, and you can make up the penalties, but the real penalties are given down by the land itself. In other words, nature will be the judge and jury of the punishment that you will receive if you do anything that contradicts those laws. And that was our philosophy. So it was rooted in land. And so when we signed these treaties, the basis was these you might want to call them environmental laws, that were given to us that we understood and we worked within. And that was our inherent way of living. And so the treaties were designed to protect our inherent way of living. And when you have Canadian legislation now, flash forward to C5 and Bill 5 in Ontario, when you have these legislations that are getting further and further away from the land governing us and us taking advantage for exploitation reasons and economic reasons, we know as Indigenous people the consequences that will result in going that route by making it easier to access, by sidestepping environmental protection laws, doing all those things. The punishment is going to be there regardless of what Canadian legislation says. And so we understand that, and that's why our inherent rights are protected. And so when they create laws to sidestep that, they're really not only breaching the treaty, but they're breaching our beliefs in natural law, which is more than a belief, it's factual as to what the results will be. And so the concern there, obviously, much like the environmentalists in Ontario and Canada, we know what the results are going to be. And so in order to ensure that those laws are protected, First Nation treaties need to be honored. And then we can start to look at ways. We're not against development, we're not against progress, but we want to do it in a responsible way that respects those laws and we stay within those laws.
There were a lot of talk at the time about massive protests, a new Idle No More taking place. Why do you think that didn't happen?
There's a number of reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons, in my own opinion, is that a lot of our communities are hurting. A lot of our communities are suffering from neglect. They're suffering from the lack of economic opportunity. So it's hard to unite in something like that when your bills are not being paid, when the challenges, the financial challenges and the realities of living in First Nation communities are constantly there. It becomes easy for government to pick us apart and separate us and strike up, deals with certain communities or individuals to break that unity. And I think this is a sign of the state of First Nations today, and how desperate First Nations can be when it comes to economic progress.
The Anishinabek Nation in particular is going to be hosting some meetings in the coming 2 months or so with grassroots. Do you think once projects get closer to potential reality that we could see some large-scale protests still?
It's always there. I think, government walks the line very closely to the next idle no more all the time. It's a direct result of lack of honoring treaties. Most of the things that come out of where government actually honors the treaties, like take the annuities, for example, it's not been volunteered for them to, let's honor the treaty. It's always been forced upon them. And you can't force good relations. Courts can't mandate, First Nations and government to have good relations. That's a political will that needs to happen. And until that happens, we're always going to be staring down the barrel of the next idle no more.
Right. Were there, or are there, I guess, any proposed projects in the territory that you represent that are of concern?
No, I think most of the projects that have larger impacts are further north than, First Nations that where my community is. But the problem is that, these wide sweeping legislations affect everybody. And, just because the critical minerals are not in Nipissing's backyard today doesn't mean that they're not going to be there tomorrow. And I think, it's incumbent upon First Nations leaders to think of these things and act responsibly, even if they're in a state of privilege where it's not really impacting them. There's not any major projects, I don't think, that I'm aware of that I would be of real concern with, but that's not to say that there won't be.
What, I guess, would be a recommendation for yourself in particular as a leader of over 20 years for a company to come to your nation and talk to you about trying to get a project off the ground?
Well, I think the first step is, having dialogue with any First Nation to really understand their way of living, how they're impacted by any events that occur in their territory. First Nations are often overlooked on our way of life because it's not the same way of life as the average Ontarian or Canadian. And there's rules and regulations that are made that overlook our way of living. And I think if companies want to be good corporate citizens in our territories, then they really have to understand the people and understand the impacts that they will be putting on them before anything is discussed in the way of development.
What are some projects or ideas in your mind that you see as being in the national interest?
Well, I think there's a lot. Critical minerals is obviously one that is in the forefront that I understand and recognize the importance of. But that's only the first step in really deciding whether these things are in the best interest of the nation. Because we have to look at those impacts. We have to look at. Canada was founded on treaties. And so there's a treaty partner there that has to be part of that process to determine whether or not it's actual nation building. Because when I hear the Prime Minister talk about nation building or important to nationhood, these national projects, I always ask myself, whose nation is he talking about? because more often than not, First Nations are not even on the radar when it comes to that kind of talk.
Chief McLeod, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for one last quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Scott McLeod, the Lake Huron Regional Chief for the Anishinabek Nation. As we mentioned, Chief McLeod, you've kind of taken on a lead role with the Chiefs of Ontario in advocating against Bill C-53. This is protecting, or the role, or the bill giving certain Métis governments recognition. Why has this been a role that you're so outspoken and passionate about?
Well, I think the reason is well, I'll tell you what the reason is not, and it's not because we're against the rights of recognized Métis in this country. The problem in Ontario is that the province and the federal government have been giving recognition to groups that claim to be Métis in our territories, when all of our research, all of our knowledge, all of our oral history shows that there have never been Métis in our territories. And so it wasn't so much Bill C-53, in what was in that bill. It was more who it was going to and who was going to benefit from it. And so it was a watering down of our identity as Indigenous people in Ontario. It was also an infringement on our treaty-protected inherent rights in Ontario. And all of it, was really not a fight between Métis people and the First Nation people of Ontario, but it was really pushing back on the Ontario and federal government in their recognition for groups that we felt didn't have those rights.
That bill, that federal act C-53, seems pretty much stalled, as the former minister said it wouldn't be moving forward in the way that it was written. But legislation for a modern-day treaty with the Manitoba Métis Federation was recently introduced. We're just down to our last minute here or so, but is that legislation that you'll be keeping an eye on?
Well, for sure. I mean, I'm a bit of a political geek when it comes to these things, so I watch a lot of these. But I mean, as far as our perspective from Ontario in that piece of legislation, we fully recognize that there in those parts of Canada there's recognition for both Métis and obviously the jurisdiction and authority of the First Nations there. It's not really something that is of concern with the First Nations in Ontario because it doesn't really impact us. Not to say that we won't lend support, but we're focused on our lane and what's happening that impacts our territories in Ontario.
Chief McLeod, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you so much for coming in and doing the show.
Thank you, Dennis.
And that is all the time we have for this week's show. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech. We will see you back here in 7 days.